Hey, Colin, great to have you with us here today. I'm super excited about this crew conversation, one of the very first ones that we're doing. And we're going to obviously dig into something that I know you feel pretty passionate about, which is leading teams, leading individuals through moments of adversity and being able to be inspiring as well, not just surviving these inevitable moments of adversity, but somehow being able to still be inspiring as a leader. So this is a heavy subject. This is obviously something that is becoming kind of the new normal. We roll from pandemics into recessions, into constant industry disruption that's happening. So we have our plethora of examples, of course, to talk about as it pertains to leading through adversity. But before we get into some of that, I would just love for you to give our audience just give us a high-level overview of kind of your career up until this point, some of the main highlights that you think are worth noting.
Yeah, firstly, I'm really thrilled to be here, Adam. I think Crew and the new initiative that you've just undertaken, I think is incredibly important at this time for leaders anywhere. So really, really pleased to be here and happy to share some of my insights. So career-wise, I can tell you that I've always been a client guy. I started my career as an area sales manager with American Express Merchant Services in London, literally pounding the streets, trying to sign up merchants to accept American Express as we were trying to grow coverage. And I then moved into the client management side as a promotional opportunity, and really then started to get serious about staying with Amex longer term and thinking about a longer term career. So I then, at the suggestion of my leader, moved into my first leadership role, which was actually leading the UK marketing team. And I did that primarily to get to the next level, but I really discovered that I enjoyed leading people. It was immensely rewarding. So that was really kind of how I got into leadership. And then I started to progress through the organization. I left London and moved to New York for a promotional opportunity, staying within client management, but joining the strategic relationship group. So managing some of the largest, most strategic retail relationships for American Express in the US. And then I moved into a new industry development role, which kind of reignited my desire to get back into a sales and business development type role. I then moved out west. I took on a regional leadership role, leading a team across 13 US states. And then I moved into Canada to run the merchant services business for Amex Bank of Canada. Then moved industries, moved into business travel, really managing the entire Canadian organization in Canada before returning back to the US in a business development role, leading our multinational organization. So I've always been client-facing in business development roles, and really that's where I see my forte.
Awesome. Yeah, quite a list of roles. You covered a lot of geographies and a lot of different
moved around a fair bit.
Yeah,
I have to say, that's the enjoying part.
Yeah. So what Colin, for you was, is there a highlight stop in that career path so far that really sticks out and is still nostalgic for you?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many, but I think the one that really stands out for me was that new industry development role. I had a tremendous opportunity to build a team from scratch. It was a growth role. The only way was up. We were basically building card acceptance in new to plastic industries. But I think for me, the key thing was my leader. I was reporting into somebody who I learned the most from. She gave me a lot of autonomy to do my own thing, and that helped me learn. So I think for me, it was a combination of the aspects of the role, but also the person I was actually reporting into. I think I basically developed so much myself as a leader under her leadership, seeing how she engaged the team and the type of insight and coaching that she was actually able to provide me during the few years that we actually worked together. So that's really the standout for me.
Yeah. That's great, because it's so interesting how I think a lot of us can relate to the favorite job isn't necessarily about the job, right? Mm-hmm. But it really does come down to types of people that we had the privilege of operating around, and if we were either led by or that we were leading, right? It's the human moments that kind of are the markers and the milestones of our career path oftentimes.
Yeah, and those relationships that you create, are going to last a lifetime as well.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something there in the overview of your career path so far around the hook for you into getting into leadership was there was a spot there where you really found leadership to feel very rewarding. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us any more about that? Like what about it what's the rewarding element that you picked up on early
Yeah.
on in your career that you really gravitate towards?
Well, I think the penny dropped when I first started getting into that role. And I started to appreciate the fact that leaders are only really as successful as their teams can be. And every individual on the team that rolls up under you is different, and they all have different needs. So for me, the fun to begin with was really trying to figure out, what are the motivators for each of the people on the team? What are some of the areas that they excel in? What are some of the things that they need to develop? And then how can I help coach them through some of those development opportunities? And then looking at the team holistically, once everything was coming together, just looking at what we can actually achieve and seeing how people actually develop. And I have a lot of people I'm still in touch with who I led a long time ago, who have gone on to be very successful. They're in much more senior positions than I'm in. And for me, that's really rewarding, because I know that in some small part, I played a role in their career development. So that for me is really the successful thing, and something I find really rewarding.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. That's awesome. It is the most fun part of the role, right? The most rewarding part is the coaching piece, is what I really picked up on there. That you get the privilege. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to coach people. And sometimes, like you said, they pass you up, and that's actually, or they end up becoming even more successful than we even imagine. And I think there is actually nothing more fulfilling than seeing that of somebody else, right? So
I completely agree.
So let's talk about the subject here that we know we wanted to dig into today, which is leading through adversity. Now, if I'm thinking through the background you just gave me an overview of, I'm thinking of a couple pillars of adversity: 9/11, global financial crisis, of course, the recent pandemic, and you were in the travel industry there, in the payments space and the financial services space for the other couple. So talk about this whole concept of leading through adversity. First of all, is there a particular time of adversity that you still to this day really feels like really tested you and your later leadership skills? Does one stand out more than the others?
Yeah, I think the one that's really top of mind for me still is the pandemic. And just for context, being in a travel organization, we found ourselves pretty quickly seeing our business model really flipped on its head. We had transaction volumes decline by over 90% year over year when the pandemic really hit. And that led to some pretty challenging client conversations, because the business model was such that in some cases, the way in which clients would fund some products and services was through the transactions that they were actually generating with us. So, the team was actually faced with the pretty daunting task of having some fairly difficult conversations with some clients about how we were actually going to have to change the way in which we supported them, or how they would actually pay for the services and products that we were actually providing. So if you look at that and think about the other aspect, which is the uncertainty of what the pandemic created. I mean, nobody knew how long this thing was going to last for. Nobody felt comfortable that they were actually going to have a job for that much longer. And here we had an entire team that was tasked with going out and having some very difficult conversations with clients. So it was really important for me as the leader over this team to demonstrate that, firstly, I was completely behind everything that we were actually being asked to do. And secondly, I was part of the solution. So one of the first things I did is I set up a strategy session with my direct reports. We talked about what it was that we needed to do. We talked about some of the things that maybe we hadn't considered, that we needed to actually consider when we were actually approaching clients. And then I asked each of my directs for their top 2 to 3 most challenging circumstances that they were actually anticipating. And I joined them for those client calls. And after each client call, we would get together as a leadership team to talk about the approach, talk about what worked well, what needed to change, and then what else we needed to do to basically set the rest of the organization up for success. So it was really a joint effort, and not something that I could claim complete responsibility for. It was the result of every team member actually having some input, and we were iterating as we were actually going along. So that's the one that really stands out for me, because at the outset it seemed so daunting, but by the time we were through it, everyone was on a high. And really, really pleased with how our clients reacted. But it was all down to the preparation and how everybody basically pitched in.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. It sounds like you really took an approach of really digging in alongside your team there through those specific right? Challenges and circumstances. It feels like a lot of authentic servant leadership that you kind of leaned on.
It absolutely was. And I think in these situations, it's so important for leaders to be authentic through this, because if you can't demonstrate that you're really involved and that you want everyone to be successful and that you're there and willing to do what you're asking your team to do, then you lose all sense of credibility and trust. For me, I think one of the biggest things you can do as a leader is to create that sense of trust, because if your team trusts you, then you're going to be successful.
Yeah. Now, when you think about that time period, were you able to have any fun doing your job? I mean, how heavy was it, right? So you said you hit a spot where eventually, thankfully, there was a high because of what you overcame together. And that is ultimately, we talk about the gifts and opportunities that every challenge presents, and the gifts and opportunities are always on the back of that. That is what when you get through it together, there's a camaraderie, a pulling together, a high, to your point. But what about the time period, like you said, the dark days? Because that's when you and I obviously got to meet and spend some time together. And I remember people that I was talking to when I was saying, hey, I want to reach out to travel organizations and support them. And they said, are you nuts? Why are you going to reach out to travel? Right? Because it was I mean, the world had such a view of, boy, I don't know how travel is going to do it. Right. In the commercial spectrum. And that's how we were all thinking. So how were you able to balance the stress and the uncertainty and the adversity personally first? And then let's talk about how you helped your group.
No, I think a couple of really good questions there. And I think the personal side I'll address first, because to your point, that's the one that I think as a leader we struggle with sometimes. There are so many expectations around us as leaders to deliver on what the company needs us to do. And if you're somebody like me, I'm restless and I have a tendency to be a workaholic. So what I learned through the pandemic is that I just needed to be really focused and really disciplined, and to carve out time for myself and my family, because otherwise it could have been a 24/7 type role and I just would have been in burnout mode. So the discipline and the commitment for me, I think were two very, very important factors. And, once I made the commitment to invest time in myself and also spend time with my family, I followed through on the commitment. So I think those were a couple of key takeaways for me personally. And then I think for the team, to begin with, you referenced dark days. There were some dark days, and it was really difficult to begin with. But then I think as we started to gain momentum, that's when we started to think about, well, how can we make this a little bit more fun? So we set up some contests for the team, some silly contests around, who can complete their spreadsheet the first. We set up some happy hours for the leadership team. But then it was also very important, as we were communicating across the broader organization, to introduce some fun aspects. So we would have some of the leaders come in and talk about some of the silly or fun things they've done with their team in the previous month. But we'd also take time to recognize outstanding performance as well. And that, for me, I think was what really kept everyone going, because people realized that it wasn't impossible to do what we were being asked to do. And by providing a platform and showcasing some of those key experiences and asking, in some cases, the individuals themselves to join and talk about what they did, it just created that sense of camaraderie. And, the fun pieces came out of that. We would open up for Q&As and, people would be cracking up and laughing and cracking jokes about certain things. So it was just really thinking through, how do we continue with the engagement and really what will resonate with the various different levels and individuals throughout the organization.
Do you feel like you all got closer as a team through that time?
Undoubtedly. And what was really rewarding for me as a leader as well is that, I would hold weekly Monday leadership team meetings where we would actually sort of set out the upcoming week of activity, some of the key priorities that we actually had to do. And then what actually happened in a very short space of time is the team started coming together themselves as well. And they would actually have a midweek meeting to make sure that they were sort of tracking with what we'd actually agreed to on the Monday meeting. So then by the time the next Monday came around, they would be providing me an update, which was completely aligned, based on the meeting that actually had the previous Wednesday. So that was a good indication that the team was in a very good place.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What about, let's just talk in general. So what do you think is kind of the main lesson that you feel like you've learned through all the turmoils that you've gone through, all the adversity moments that you've not just survived, but operated and learned how to thrive through. Is there any kind of key leadership lessons that you feel like they've really stuck with you? They've changed you, so to speak, even maybe than before?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. I think the authenticity piece, that's really been cemented, I think, through the last couple of years, and particularly through the pandemic. I think as a leader, it's all too easy sometimes just to actually push the responsibility onto the next level down. I think stepping in and really digging in deep and demonstrating that you can do what you're actually asking your teams to do. And I say teams collectively because in many cases, as senior leaders, we have multiple layers and levels within our organizations. So it's really sort of being front and center and demonstrating that you're actually doing what you're actually asking the teams to do. But then I think the communication aspect has also been critical, because all too often it's easy just to say, this is what needs to be done. And then it gets lost in translation as it sort of filters through the organization. So I think having regular communication in place and the ability to basically articulate what needs to be done and being very open and transparent about the progress that's being made and where we have some gaps and what else needs to actually happen in order for us to be successful. And then also connecting with multiple people within the organization. So you're not just in touch with your direct reports. I'm a big believer in doing skip levels. And I would, regularly have in my schedule skip level discussions so that I could understand how different leaders are leading, how people are interpreting what it is that we actually had to do as an organization. And that's incredibly important, both in terms of me providing feedback to my direct reports, but then also understanding how we may need to change the communication and help people sort of get to the place where they needed to be to execute effectively.
Yeah. Good, really, really good stuff. Any mistakes you feel like you made? We all make them, right? We all have our thing. Sometimes it's the best thing because we learn a lot.
We've all made mistakes. I remember there was one incident in particular, and it was not long after I was promoted from a director to a VP. And I'd moved from London to New York, and I was doing my best to impress my new leader as a newly promoted VP. And this one individual, who I will not name, basically took me aside one day and said, "Look, you're a great guy, and I'm really pleased that they've actually appointed you, but you've got to understand something." And I said, "Well, what's going wrong?" And he said, "You've got to understand now that you're my boss and I have a job to do. Your job isn't to do my job. It's to help me do my job better." And I found that I was so focused on getting the actual activity achieved that I was stepping in and doing the job that this individual should have been doing, rather than me sort of giving him a little bit of autonomy to go out and do his job. So that was a really interesting learning, and it stayed with me through every other role that I've actually moved into since then.
Wow, that's awesome. You always hope that people feel like they can feel comfortable enough when we're working with them to come and tell you these things, right?
Yeah.
Because so often in commercial cultures, it's so passive aggressive and you never get that kind of feedback. And I think it should be a lesson to everyone out there that's listening that you do that feedback well at the right time, and it's powerful. It's powerful in helping to change that individual's perspective. But look, this is a thing that you're so thankful of. So that's a really cool example of taking something that was maybe a little weak spot, but turning it into a long-term strength.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're all continually learning. That's my philosophy here, and that if I can get some feedback from somebody and it's about something that I hadn't considered or didn't realize, then that's invaluable. And it's then down to me to take the appropriate action to address it.
Yeah. So Colin, on that note of that really important feedback that you feel like you got, what I'm picking up there, and as it pertains to earlier parts of our conversation, is it's such a fine line of moments when it's all about being in the trenches, sleeves rolled up, servant leadership, and then how much people, though, at the same time or very quickly after, we need to be able to toggle back and recognize now is the time when I need to provide them autonomy and empower them. How do you know when that tipping point moment is? How do you stay in tune with that, you think?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's not easy. It's really not easy either, because I think as the leader, as the authentic leader, wanting to basically get in there and prove that you're there with your teams and that you're actually not asking them to do anything you wouldn't do personally, you need to sort of have that initial, I think, sort of hands-on type approach. But then I think you have to have the trust, and in some cases, it may even be a little bit of a leap of faith to say, okay, now we've gone through this, right? Now we've demonstrated how it can be done. I'm taking a step back because it's now your job to sort of take it forward. And I think unless you do that, you're not going to be in a situation where the teams do feel empowered, and it's going to have some, some negative consequences. People don't like being micromanaged, and in some cases, a micromanagement type approach can just add to the stress because they feel as though there's no relief. They're not being given any opportunity to basically prove that they can actually do what they're being asked to do. So for me, I think what I learned, especially through the pandemic, is after that first round of difficult conversations that we actually had, I started asking the direct report in particular, so for this next upcoming call, do you want to take the lead? And I'll just sit in the background, or do you actually want me on the call? And that's, it was basically, it evolved and it was different. It happened faster with some people than it did others, because not everyone actually had the same level of confidence. And that's the other piece, there's not a cookie cutter approach to this. I think it depends on the individuals that you're actually working with, their level of competence and their level of confidence in what you're actually asking them to do.
Yeah, and let me ask you this. Have you ever, on that note, have you ever let somebody fail? I mean, do you believe in that? I mean, have you ever, it's in the essence of growth, and people sometimes learn best. I think we can personally relate. We sometimes learn best through our own mistakes or failures. It's so hard to do because we're always responsible. Every level above that person is responsible for anyone's mistakes or setbacks.
Yes.
And yet that's where people talk about some of the best growth happens. So have you ever actually let somebody fail? Do you believe in that, or how do you do that?
I have, and I do believe in it. But I think as the leader, it's my responsibility to determine the level of risk. So I think failing when the consequence isn't too dire is okay. But I wouldn't set somebody up to fail knowing that it's going to cost us a client relationship or something. So I think again, it's a fine line, and you have to determine what is the risk associated with that failure, and really making a call. It's a judgment call in most cases.
I agree. I think that part right there is an art. The ability to make sure you're always allowing people to develop, and a part of development is mistakes and failures, and yet being able to report that or sell that or cover that upwards, right? That is a challenge that I think we're faced with, and it requires a lot of conviction and being able to stick there. And I love what you said, hedging your bets and doing just the right amount of risk. Yeah. Yeah. So I was just reading this morning, that Bezos is saying, hey, everybody should cut back, get ready, so it's one more pretty intelligent person telling us about the uncertainty that we're facing. So who knows where this is going? We seem to be right in a recession or on the verge of one. We don't know how long, how deep and wide again. So it's one of those moments, and it's only right around the corner from the moment we just got through that we're talking about.
And
which your point was, So what do you think companies, when you think you worked for pretty good ones, what do you think they need to be thinking about as we now, for leaders, especially senior leaders that are asked to constantly keep everybody else inspired and in check, as they're now going back to back basically on major, only a couple times in a lifetime types of challenges. In fact, the one was probably the once in a lifetime one, right?
Yes.
What are companies, what do they need to be thinking about? Do you have any thoughts in general, of what they need to be doing differently, particularly for the senior leaders that are having to navigate the people through this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Adam. And there's a lot of focus and a lot of discussion at the moment around wellness. And I know a lot of companies are actually focusing on that. But for me, as I think about the pressures and the challenges that a lot of senior leaders have, I think companies really do need to think about, is there the right support structure in place for senior leaders? And, we've all been there. We've all worked for organizations where leaders are somewhat reluctant to ask for help, especially senior leaders, because it could be a sign of weakness. And, like it or not, some organizations are, somewhat political as well. So there's that whole sort of political dynamic, or that landscape that leaders actually have to navigate. So my question for a lot of companies would be, are you convinced that you have the right support structure in place for your senior leadership team? And if you don't, what could that support structure look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we just expect senior leaders that have done well clearly in their career to get to these positions of authority, or of the higher levels of the organization. We somehow expect them to be superhuman amidst all of this. And just because you have amazing leadership competency and you've made the right decisions and had the fortune, let's be honest, or the good luck of sometimes getting into the right positions at the right place, that doesn't mean they don't need the support. And if anything, we're expecting them to control the vortex and positively influence the vortex of everybody that's going through this in their organizations or their remit. We have to make sure we support them, and that they feel safe, to your point, that they feel safe about saying, hey, I'm burnt right now, or I'm stressed, or I'm very concerned, whatever those things are. I really feel like we don't talk enough about that at the senior levels. And I think companies are, to your point, we're talking a lot about wellness. We're talking a lot about support infrastructures, but I'm hoping that they're ready for it at that level, because I think the senior levels, and you don't have to take our opinion on it, right? You could read every major research sample that's been done by the Gartners and the Deloittes over the past couple of years. They're stretched and they're a little weathered right now.
Yeah, completely.
And they've been riding a high, hopefully, right? In a lot of industries, they got through it. But if this is bad again, I don't know. I just really hope that companies have really done more than just talk about it, and really have thought proactively about the support at the very top.
Yeah, what can they do? Because, we're talking about leading through adversity, but I think you combine that with ambiguity. And let's face it, there's so much change at the moment that, there's a lot of ambiguity out there. So I think trying to figure your way through some of this sometimes without having the right support network is incredibly challenging. It really is.
Yeah. I'm glad you bring up ambiguity. I have, when I left the corporate world, so to speak, and I kind of started getting into some more of the startup type of space, the main knock that everyone that I was meeting from a startup background, that folks in the corporate, if you grew up in the bigger enterprise space, for instance, they don't think that operating in ambiguity is something that's a strength. And I happen to disagree with that. I mean, so what's your perspective on, you worked a lot of jobs in a lot of the enterprise spaces. Are you comfortable in ambiguity? I mean, do you feel like you've had the opportunity to have been in places where there was a lot of ambiguity and you had to learn how to get comfortable with it?
Oh, very, very, very much so. Very much so. I can remember the one that really stands out for me is a role that I took on leading our Canadian business when I was in travel. And, I was given a lot of autonomy, which was great, but I had to deal with a lot of ambiguity because there were a lot of factors that hadn't previously been identified that were impacting the business in a negative way. And there wasn't a playbook. There wasn't a playbook to say, okay, in this instance, this is what you do. So you just had to kind of figure it out. And in some cases, I made some mistakes and I learned from the mistakes, but ultimately I was able to figure it out. But I think to me, it's having the trust in the individual that's actually in that role to figure it out for themselves. Because as we were talking about earlier on, sometimes it's difficult to raise your hand and ask for help. But sometimes that's because you're not given enough autonomy to figure it out for yourself. So it's an interesting dilemma when you're thinking about it, because in some cases, senior leaders really want that autonomy, but unless they're given it, they find it hard to sort of deal with the ambiguity because the approach may be too rigid. Yeah.
No, that's really spot on. I think that's a very cool perspective on that. So Colin, the adversity moments that you just talked about going through, what are what's a major learning or a key takeaway that you're kind of pulling with you from that really sticks out?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. I think for me, it's really about, as the most senior leader who is responsible for a lot of what we were trying to do at that time, it was really important for me to maintain a very, very consistent demeanor. And that demeanor was always cool, calm, and collected. That's probably the best way to describe it. Because, what I found is that sometimes we would think there's a huge issue or a huge problem and people were getting really worked up about it. But if you level the conversation to around what are the circumstances, what's the context here, what are the facts, and what's the path forward. And it's always focusing on the path forward, because sometimes you can just get dragged down into the details and then everyone gets confused. So it's really more around, what are we trying to solve for here? How do we do it in a way in which is going to work out for us and the customer, and actually have a very, very positive outcome? And it's a little bit like the analogy where you see the duck floating on the pond. You know, you see this cool, calm, collected duck floating on the pond. You don't realize what's actually happening underneath. And 9 times out of 10, you know, that's what would be happening. I'd be talking to my team, and I'd, you know, back in my mind, I'd be very, very concerned, but I couldn't let the team know that. Because if I acted like that as the leader, then it's not really setting the right tone for the organization. So again, I think key takeaway for me is around sort of, as a leader, all eyes are on you, and your team is actually going to take their lead from how you actually react to any given situation.
So Colin, you're now at a spot where you're looking into a new chapter, let's say, right? Talk a little bit about that. I mean, what are you hoping for here next? I mean, is there, and I know you may not have that all figured out, but how is this transition going for you? And what are you thinking about now that is maybe different than any other kind of past periods of transitioning or moving in between different types of roles?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam, because if I think back over the last 20 or so years, you know, the transitions have really been from one role to another. Now I'm in, I think, a great situation where I'm being able to take a step back, really think through what's important to me, and then make a decision. If I want to move into a new role, it's got to kind of check all the boxes based on what's important to me. And, you know, I'm really, really focused on culture. So company culture for me is paramount, but also the ability to make a change and the ability to really make a difference. I'm not really wedded to a particular industry, but I think, you know, those factors combined with, you know, being in a client environment for me are sort of top of mind. But I'm not rushing. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. I'm having fun with you and Andy with Crew at the moment as well. And you know, I think there's a ton of opportunity out here as people kind of figure out what's next for them and their organizations.
Yeah. It sounds like you're really tuning into kind of the whole. I was going to ask you, my follow-up question was going to be, what are you looking for your leadership legacy to be, right? I mean, what are you hoping that when people think about you and they think about your career, if they've had the privilege of knowing you and working with you and all of that, what do you hope they say? It feels like you're really tuning into that next chapter of the contribution aspect, the bigger picture items that if you haven't hit it yet, you're going to make sure you hit.
No, you're right.
What do you think about that word? I mean, the word legacy, I mean, what does it mean for you? What are you hoping to kind of really leave behind as it pertains to your leadership legacy?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a great question. I think I hope that what I'm leaving behind is a sense that I was a really genuine leader who was interested in the people that actually, you know, were part of my team, and that I had a positive impact on their career. So it's really that genuine care for people, and, you know, having the opportunity to sort of help individuals grow and be more successful. That to me, if you know, if you poll 10 people and 9 of them said that, I'd be very, very happy.
I agree. That would be a very good batting average, and it's a pretty honorable thing that I'm pretty sure people are going to be saying that about you, because that's what I already hear. So I think you're on the right track there, Colin.
Thank you. I hope so. I do hope so.
And when we think about, so I do want to ask you, because we are, as you've mentioned a couple of times here, we're getting this networking community concept off the ground here, and Colin happened to be, for everyone that's listening, one of the very first people that bravely said, yeah, I'll come in and check this out with you all. Not just check it out, but it's clear that you're inspired from the pieces you just mentioned of contributing, right? And doing something that means something good for others and change and all of that, which is really at the ethos of what we're trying to do through providing this platform for all of us as leaders and peers. But anything else that you would just say of why you're joining this with us right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is going back to what we were talking about earlier, your question about, you know, what should companies be doing differently? You know, I really don't think there is currently a really valuable network, of trusted advisors that people, in senior leadership roles can actually tap into. So, I think this checks all the boxes for me there. It's also something that, I passionately believe in terms of, overall leadership development. So if I can contribute some way to this and help people grow and help support other leaders, I'll be very, very happy to do so. And I'll find that extremely rewarding. And I also just think overall, as I was talking earlier on about the impact that one individual leader had on me, I've had the luxury of actually having, a number of really great leaders, and it makes such a difference. And I know that had I not had the benefit of working for some of those people, that I would not have grown and developed in the way in which I did. So I think for me, Crew can play part of that role, and it can actually help leaders become much more effective. It can help people grow personally and develop and professionally, and make a big contribution to the way in which our economy continues to evolve. So,
yeah. Well, I agree with you. I mean, I feel that, what we're trying to do here is make sure that that people are connected to folks that they can really lean on, to your point. And authenticity is the word you keep mentioning. And it's truly at the core of what we're trying to unleash and cultivate here. And I agree with you. I think we all have these pit stops and moments when we have exposure to really awesome leadership. And wouldn't it be cool if you always had access, number one, and exposure to those types of leaders? Because the reality is sometimes we don't have that type of a leadership that we're working under, or we're in a lot of transition. And the reality is we're not staying in our jobs nearly as long these days for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And so I think having that consistency element there of people, to your point, the peer advisory board and this high quality of leaders, they're in that giving mentality that you can always go to and have that access to, even if you're not necessarily working for one, or if you just want a different perspective, even if the one you're working for is great. I think all of that is what we're trying to have. And it's folks like you that are really, I think, bringing this to life, right? It was an idea for us, but it's been the early founding members and the early adopter types of mentalities that are really helping us get really inspired about just what this can become. So we just want to say, and I want to just say, hey, thank you for taking a leap on that and joining. And also thank you for having this conversation, because I already felt like I knew you, but it's so cool to do these and to just hone in specifically kind of on an angle that somebody's passionate about, and to learn some of these nuggets and wisdom about kind of your core leadership. This was really entertaining from my perspective. So I think that people listening and watching will also think it's really great.
Well, I hope so. Well, thanks so much for the conversation, Adam. It's been great. And, kudos to you for this initiative. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, Colin. Great having you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Crew Conversations. These conversations are for leaders, between leaders, and by leaders to inspire you to grow into the type of leader you want to become.